God, please. I'm not ready." Those were my last conscious words as my car rolled down that dark embankment. I wasn't praying out of faith that night. It was pure terror speaking. You see, I was the type of person who only reached for God when things went terribly wrong. But what happened in the next 13 minutes and 42 seconds would completely transform everything I understood about prayer, reality, and the invisible war being waged through our words. My name is Olivia Quinn, and on October 15th, 2023, I died. Technically, at least. The doctors called it a miracle when they brought me back, but they don't know what I saw on the other side, how prayers literally bend reality, create ripples through time, and forge paths through darkness. They don't know about the countless prayers that had been protecting me all along, or how even my weakest prayers had changed more than I could have imagined. I was driving home after spending the evening with my grandchildren. It was around 9:45 p.m., and the autumn air had that particular crispness that makes you want to hurry home to a warm cup of tea. I remember feeling particularly satisfied that evening. My youngest granddaughter, Emma, had just learned to ride her bike without training wheels, and watching her wobble across their driveway had filled my heart with such joy. I was about 20 minutes from home when it happened. The road was dark. You know how it gets on those rural stretches where the streetlights are few and far between. I remember reaching to adjust the heater, and that's when I saw them. Two bright deer eyes reflecting my headlights. I swerved instinctively, but at 55 miles per hour, things happen fast. Too fast. They say your life flashes before your eyes in moments like these, but that's not what happened to me. Instead, time seemed to slow down as my car veered off the road. I remember the sickening feeling of weightlessness as the vehicle rolled down the embankment. The last thing I heard was the crushing of metal and breaking glass. And then, silence. What happened next would take me far longer than these words to fully process, but I'll do my best to share it with you. The doctors later told me that I was clinically dead for 13 minutes and 42 seconds. They said it was a miracle that the couple driving by spotted my car's taillights through the trees and called for help. But what happened during those minutes, those precious minutes between this world and the next, that's what I need to share with you today. The first thing I noticed was the absence of pain. One moment I was trapped in a mangled car, and the next I was experiencing something so profound that words feel inadequate to describe it. There was a sensation of being lifted, but not physically. It was as if every worry, every fear, every earthly concern was being gently removed from my consciousness. I found myself in what I can only describe as a space of pure light, but it wasn't blinding. It was warm, welcoming, and more real than anything I'd ever experienced. And in this space, I wasn't alone. There was a presence, no, multiple presences, but one in particular drew my attention. It wasn't a physical form as we understand it, but I knew with absolute certainty that I was in the presence of Jesus Christ. Now, remember how I mentioned being a Christmas and Easter Christian? Well, in that moment, I felt such profound shame about my lukewarm faith. But here's the extraordinary thing. Instead of judgment, I felt nothing but pure, unconditional love. It was overwhelming, but not in an uncomfortable way. It was like finally coming home after being away for far too long. What happened next was something I never expected. Jesus began showing me moments from my life, but not in the way you might think. Instead of a chronological replay, I was shown specific instances where prayers, not just my own, but prayers from others, had intersected with my life's journey. I saw my mother, years ago, on her knees beside her bed, praying fervently for my protection after I'd stormed out of the house during a teenage rebellion phase. I witnessed my late husband, whom I'd lost to cancer 5 years prior, praying for our children's future long after he knew he wouldn't be there to see it. But most surprisingly, I saw countless moments where people I'd barely known, sometimes complete strangers, had lifted me up in prayer. What shocked me most was seeing how these prayers had actually altered the fabric of reality around me. It wasn't like watching a movie. It was like seeing the invisible threads that connect all of creation being gently redirected by these prayers. I saw moments where disaster had been averted, opportunities that had mysteriously appeared, and healing that had come just when needed, all in response to prayer. One particular moment stood out. Remember that job I lost back in 2019? I'd been bitter about it for years, blaming office politics and unfair treatment. But in this divine perspective, I saw how that job loss had actually been a response to my daughter's prayers. She had been praying for months, asking God to help me find a way to be closer to my grandchildren. The job I lost had been keeping me tied to a city 3 hours away from them. Within 2 months of losing that position, I'd found work just 15 minutes from their home. The presence of Jesus then showed me something that left me breathless, a sort of control room of prayer, if you will. I saw how every sincere prayer created ripples in reality, like drops in a cosmic pond. These ripples would interact with other prayers, creating patterns of divine intervention that were far more intricate and beautiful than anything we could orchestrate on our own. But here's where it gets even more interesting. I was shown how my own lack of prayer had created what I can only describe as gaps in this divine tapestry. These weren't punishments or signs of abandonment. Rather, they were spaces where God had respected my free will to handle things on my own, even when His help was readily available. I saw specific instances where my stubborn self-reliance had made things unnecessarily difficult. Remember that time I mentioned being a Christmas and Easter Christian? Well, I was shown how many blessings and divine appointments I'd missed simply because I hadn't bothered to pray or maintain a relationship with God. The presence of Jesus communicated with me, not in words exactly, but in pure understanding. He showed me how prayer isn't just about asking for things. It's about aligning our will with God's perfect plan. It's about participating in the ongoing creation and maintenance of reality itself. Every prayer, no matter how small, contributes to this divine symphony. I was shown how prayers of gratitude were particularly powerful. They created what looked like golden threads in the tapestry of reality, strengthening everything they touched. I saw how my grandmother's habit of thanking God for every little blessing had created a protective network around our entire family that had lasted for generations. Then came the most humbling part of the experience. I was shown how my tendency to judge others had created barriers not just in my relationships, but in the flow of divine grace. You see, I had this habit of mentally criticizing people at church who seemed too religious or showy about their faith. I'd roll my eyes at those who would raise their hands during worship or say, "Praise the Lord," at every opportunity. But in this divine perspective, I saw how these very people were often the ones whose prayers had helped me most. Their genuine faith and consistent prayer life had created channels of blessing that had benefited not just them, but everyone around them, including cynical me. The presence of Jesus then showed me something that brought me to my knees, metaphorically speaking, since I wasn't in my physical body. He revealed how every single prayer ever prayed for me was stored in what I can only describe as a heavenly treasury. Not one had been forgotten or gone unheard. Even prayers from people who had long since passed away were still active, still creating ripples of blessing in my life. I saw prayers from my father, who had died when I was just 12, still influencing my life 40 years later. I saw prayers from my Sunday school teacher from 2nd grade still protecting me in ways I'd never realized. It was overwhelming to see how loved and prayed for I had been, even during times when I felt most alone. But then came the most shocking revelation of all. I was shown how prayer actually changes the prayer more than anything else. Each sincere prayer created what looked like a small light within the person praying, gradually transforming them from the inside out. I saw how people who maintained consistent prayer lives literally glowed with an inner light that affected everything and everyone around them. This understanding came with a gentle but firm correction of some misconceptions I'd held about prayer. I had always thought of prayer as a way to get God to do what we want, like a cosmic vending machine where you insert prayers and get blessings in return. But what I was shown was that true prayer is about aligning our hearts with God's will, about joining in His work rather than trying to bend Him to our will. I was shown how many of my unanswered prayers had actually been answers in disguise. Remember that time I prayed desperately for my son to get into his dream college? When he didn't get in, I had been angry with God. But now I saw how that no had protected him from influences that would have led him down a destructive path. The college he ended up attending was where he met his wife and found his true calling in life. The presence of Jesus then showed me something that made me weep. How many times he had wanted to help, to intervene, to bless, but couldn't because I hadn't asked. Not because he was being petty or playing games, but because he respects our free will so much that he often waits to be invited into our situations through prayer. I was shown how prayer creates a kind of permission structure in the spiritual realm. When we pray, we're essentially opening doors for divine intervention. Without prayer, many of these doors remain closed, not because God isn't willing to help, but because He waits to be invited. This revelation was particularly convicting when I saw how many times I'd complained about situations in my life without ever really praying about them. I'd grumble about my neighbors' noisy parties, but never prayed for them. I'd worry about my grandchildren's future, but rarely brought these concerns to God in genuine prayer. The presence of Jesus then showed me something that filled me with awe, the power of corporate prayer. I saw how prayers prayed in agreement with others created what looked like mighty rivers of light in the spiritual realm. These rivers could overcome obstacles that individual prayers sometimes couldn't. This helped me understand why Jesus said, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them." I was shown how my casual dismissal of prayer meetings and group prayer had actually cost me and others significant blessings. Those Wednesday night prayer meetings I always skipped, they weren't just social gatherings, they were powerful opportunities to participate in God's work that I'd missed out on. But here's the beautiful thing, even in showing me my mistakes, there was no condemnation. Instead, there was an overwhelming sense of opportunity. It wasn't too late to change, to start participating in this divine dance of prayer and answered prayer. Throughout this experience, I was also shown how prayer affects what we might call coincidences. You know those moments when you think of someone and they call right after? Or when you happen to run into exactly the person you needed to talk to? I saw how many of these coincidences were actually carefully orchestrated responses to someone's prayers. I witnessed how prayers created what looked like bridges between people, situations, and resources. These bridges often lay dormant until the right moment, then activated to create what we call coincidences. It was amazing to see how many lucky breaks in my life had actually been carefully planned responses to someone's prayers. The presence of Jesus then showed me something about spiritual warfare that transformed my understanding. I saw how prayer created a kind of protective shield around people and situations. In areas where there was little prayer coverage, I could see what looked like dark spots where negative influences had more freedom to operate. But in areas covered by prayer, there was a luminous protection that negative forces couldn't penetrate. This helped me understand why Paul wrote about putting on the whole armor of God and praying at all times. Prayer wasn't just about asking for things. It was about maintaining a spiritual environment where God's presence could freely operate. I was shown how my habit of worrying instead of praying had actually created opportunities for negative influences in my life. Each worry was like a small crack in my spiritual armor, while each prayer was like a repair strengthening that same armor. Then came a revelation about forgiveness and prayer that left me stunned. I was shown how unforgiveness in my heart had created blockages in the flow of answered prayer. Remember that grudge I'd held against my sister-in-law for those thoughtless comments at last year's Christmas dinner? That unforgiveness had been creating static in my prayer life, making it harder for me to hear God's voice and receive His blessings. The presence of Jesus showed me how forgiveness and prayer work together. When we pray for those who've hurt us, it not only frees them, it frees us. I saw how prayers for our enemies, as Jesus commanded, actually create channels of blessing that flow back to us. But perhaps the most profound revelation was about the relationship between prayer and time. I was shown how prayers don't just affect the present and future. They can also heal the past. Not by changing what happened, but by changing how those events affect us and others in the present. I saw how prayers prayed today could bring healing to generations of family trauma, breaking cycles of pain and dysfunction. I witnessed how my own grandmother's prayers were still affecting our family, creating opportunities for healing and restoration even years after her passing. The presence of Jesus then showed me something about prayer and eternity that expanded my understanding dramatically. I saw how every prayer prayed in faith becomes part of an eternal tapestry, continuing to affect reality long after the prayer is spoken. This helped me understand why the Bible talks about our prayers being stored in golden bowls in heaven. As this incredible experience began to draw to a close, I was given one final powerful revelation about prayer. I was shown how every sincere prayer, no matter how poorly worded or theologically imperfect, is translated by the Holy Spirit into perfect alignment with God's will. This helped me understand why Paul wrote that the Spirit helps us in our weakness, interceding for us with groanings too deep for words. I saw how many times I'd held back from praying because I didn't feel my prayers were good enough, or because I didn't know the right words to say. But in this divine perspective, I saw how God looks at the heart behind the prayer, rather than the eloquence of the words. Just before I was sent back, I was given a mission. I was shown how sharing this experience would create new possibilities for others to understand and engage with prayer in a deeper way. I was told that my story would help others move from seeing prayer as a religious duty to understanding it as a privilege and opportunity to participate in God's ongoing work in the world. When I regained consciousness in the hospital 3 days later, the doctors were amazed at my recovery. They couldn't explain how I had survived the accident with relatively minor injuries, given the condition of my car. But I knew. I had seen the prayers that had surrounded me, protected me, and brought me back. Since that experience, my relationship with prayer has completely transformed. It's no longer a religious obligation or a last resort when things go wrong. It's become as natural as breathing, a constant conversation with a loving Father who is more involved in our lives than we can imagine. I've learned to pray differently now. Instead of just presenting my wish list to God, I spend more time listening, seeking to understand His heart and align my will with His. I've learned to pray with more gratitude, more faith, and more awareness of how my prayers affect not just my life, but the lives of others. I've also learned to value the prayers of others more. Those prayer chains and prayer meetings I used to dismiss, I now see them as powerful opportunities to participate in God's work. I've started a prayer group in my neighborhood, and the coincidences we've witnessed as a result have been nothing short of miraculous. But perhaps the biggest change has been in how I view reality itself. I no longer see the world as a closed system where things just happen randomly. Instead, I see it as a dynamic interplay between the natural and spiritual realms, where prayer creates channels for God's power and presence to flow into situations and lives. I'm sharing this story not to draw attention to myself, but to help others understand what I now know with absolute certainty. Prayer changes things. It changes situations. It changes others. And most importantly, it changes us. Every prayer matters. every prayer is heard. Every prayer creates ripples in reality that extend far beyond what we can see or imagine. So if you're like I was, someone who sees prayer as optional or ineffective, I invite you to reconsider. The power to affect reality is literally at your fingertips. All it takes is the willingness to reach out to a God who is more eager to respond than we are to ask. And if you're someone who already believes in prayer, I hope my experience encourages you to persist, even when you don't see immediate results. Your prayers are creating changes in the spiritual realm that will manifest in God's perfect timing. Remember, prayer isn't about trying to convince God to do what we want. It's about aligning ourselves with what He already wants to do. It's about participating in His work of redemption and restoration in the world. And every single prayer, even the shortest, simplest prayer, contributes to this divine work in ways we may never fully understand this side of heaven. As I close this story, I want to tell you one last thing. Since my experience, I've developed a habit of praying for everyone who hears or reads my story. So if you're reading these words right now, know that you've already been prayed for. And if you're currently going through struggles of your own, I want you to know that your situation isn't hopeless. Whether you're dealing with health issues, relationship problems, financial difficulties, or spiritual doubts, prayer has the power to change your reality just as it changed mine. You might be wondering how my life has changed since that night. Well, I've become what my old self would have probably called one of those religious people. But you know what? I don't care. When you've seen what I've seen, when you've experienced what I've experienced, you can't help but be transformed. Every morning now, I wake up early to pray. Not because I feel obligated, but because I can't wait to connect with God. I keep a prayer journal where I record not just my requests, but also the answers I see, even the ones that don't look like answers at first. It's amazing to look back and see patterns of God's faithfulness that I might have missed otherwise. Remember how I mentioned my habit of judging others? Well, that's changed too. Now, when I see someone at church raising their hands in worship or praying out loud, I think about those beautiful streams of light I witnessed in the spiritual realm. Sometimes I even join them, though I'll admit it took some time to get comfortable with that. My relationships have deepened significantly. My children have noticed the change in me. "Mom," my daughter said recently, "you're different since the accident. Calmer somehow. More present." She's right. When you understand that prayer isn't just a religious activity, but a direct line to the throne room of God, it changes how you approach everything in life. I've also become more intentional about creating a legacy of prayer for my grandchildren. Every night, I spend time praying specifically for each one of them, just as I saw my grandmother's prayers continuing to affect our family generations later. I'm teaching them about prayer too, helping them understand that God isn't some distant figure in the sky, but a loving Father who delights in their simple, childlike faith. The accident left me with some physical reminders, a slight limp that acts up in cold weather, and a few scars that tell their own story. But I'm grateful for these reminders. They help me remember that every breath is a gift, and every moment is an opportunity to connect with God through prayer. Some people have asked me if I'm ever afraid that sharing my story will make me sound crazy. Honestly, I don't worry about that anymore. What I experienced was more real than anything I've known in this physical world, and if my story helps even one person understand the power of prayer, then any skepticism I might face is worth it. I want to be clear about something, though. My experience doesn't make me special. The same God who showed me these things is available to everyone who seeks Him. You don't need to have a near-death experience to understand the power of prayer. You just need to be willing to take that first step of faith. Since that night, I've witnessed countless answers to prayer, both big and small. I've seen marriages restored, addictions broken, and diseases healed. I've also seen tiny coincidences that I now recognize as God's handiwork. the right person calling at just the right moment, an unexpected check arriving when bills were due, a word of encouragement coming exactly when needed. But perhaps the most beautiful thing I've witnessed is how prayer creates community. That prayer group I mentioned starting in my neighborhood, it's grown from 3 people meeting in my living room to over 20 people gathering weekly. We've seen lives transformed, relationships restored, and miracles happen right in our midst. One of our neighbors, a self-proclaimed atheist, recently asked if she could join our group. "I don't believe what you believe," she said, "but there's something different about you all, and I want to understand it." That's the power of prayer. It doesn't just change circumstances. It changes people in ways that others can't help but notice. I've learned that prayer isn't just about speaking. It's about listening too. Some of my most profound prayer times now are spent in silence, just being still in God's presence. Remember how I mentioned seeing those golden threads of gratitude in the spiritual realm? I try to weave those threads daily now, thanking God for everything from the morning sunrise to the ability to take my next breath. As I wrap up my story, I want to leave you with a challenge. For the next 30 days, try approaching prayer differently. Don't think of it as a religious duty or a last resort. Think of it as a conversation with someone who loves you more than you can imagine. Someone who has the power and desire to work in your life in ways you haven't even thought to ask for. Start small if you need to. Take 5 minutes each morning to simply say thank you for another day. Write down your prayers and the answers you see. Share your prayer journey with others. Watch for those coincidences that might actually be God's answers in disguise. Remember what I saw about prayers being stored in heaven? Nothing is wasted. No prayer is too small, too simple, or too late. Every sincere prayer creates ripples in reality that extend far beyond what we can see or understand. And if you're someone who, like I used to be, only prays when things go wrong, I encourage you to expand your prayer life. Don't wait for a crisis to reach out to God. Build that relationship now, in the ordinary moments of life. Because when the storms come, and they will come, you'll already know the way to your shelter. Finally, I want you to know that sharing this story is itself an answer to prayer. During my experience, when I was shown how my story would help others understand prayer differently, I felt overwhelmed by the responsibility. But I also felt incredibly honored to be entrusted with this message. So as you finish reading these words, know that you're not here by accident. Whether you're a longtime believer, a skeptic, or somewhere in between, your encounter with this story is part of God's plan for your life. And yes, I'm still praying for everyone who reads or hears this story, asking God to help each person understand the incredible power they have access to through prayer. Because prayer really does change reality. It changed mine, and it can change yours too. All you have to do is begin.